everyone. Welcome back to the Veterinary AI Brief. My name is Dr. Adam Little, one of your co-hosts alongside Robert Sanchez and Dr. Aaron Massecar, philosopher and veterinary specialist in training. It's been a moment since we were back together, and there's lots of news for us to break into, so really excited to kick things off. How's your summer been going, gents?
It's been good. It's been really good. Lots of camping, lots of travel. Great.
I mean, incredible. The last 2 months since we've been off it feels like 10 years have passed in the industry, and it's been a ton of fun. And then also like two small children who are increasingly developing and loving each other. It's just a really cool time.
Awesome. That's great. And it sounds like neither of you has been involved in a lawsuit involving a pharmaceutical company. So getting to our first story, you're already ahead of the folks at Columbia Veterinary Hospital. This one's been going through the news over the last week or so. So maybe just to break down what happened and why this is a bit of a watershed moment. We've been hearing a lot about the implications around safety and transparency. There's been lots of stories in the past that we've been speaking about on this podcast about veterinary radiology and pathology. And this is all kind of coming to bear in our first story. So the specifics, there was a practice. Columbia Veterinary Hospital has just filed a lawsuit against Zoetis. There was an 11-year-old dog that had a neck mass that their vet scan images technology identified initially as non-cancerous, then later was found via University Pathology Department to be an aggressive form of cancer. The pet went through surgery. They had to go through surgery again and unfortunately died from post-operative complications on that second procedure, which the hospital is claiming was only necessary because of the misdiagnosis associated with Images AI capabilities. So the hospital is seeking $50,000 in damages, alleging fraud and deceptive practices. There's some back and forth in terms of the communication between Zoetis and the hospital throughout this process. But this is, I think, fair to say, probably the most direct kind of legal matter we've seen in the veterinary space involving AI. So maybe I'll stop there and turn it over to Aaron and Rob. What are your kind of thoughts when you're reading this? What should we be taking away? Is there like a clear, who's to blame here? What do you think about this particular case?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in. It's tough, right? Because this is specifically one of those cases where the outcome is the death of the animal, and that death of the animal is not necessarily a result of the vet scan imagist and the way that that tool is being used, right? And so I think that there are some things that need to be parsed out. So one of them is, what is the specific outcome that happened, and what is the legal case, and what are the actions that each side is taking, and how is all that being pulled together? I think the other thing that what this really gets to is something that I think all of us were kind of waiting for, was that at some point somebody's going to do something solely based on the AI, and ultimately who is responsible at that point. And so this case shows us what happens from a clinic perspective and how they think that the company offering the AI is at least to some degree responsible for the outcome. And it's been very clear from a lot of the recommendations that come out of organizations like the American Association of Veterinary State Boards, which, yes, it does not have any sort of binding applications to state legislatures or anything like that, but it does provide guidance. And in that guidance, it very specifically says that the veterinarian is ultimately responsible, and that's how they should be acting. Now, the thing that I start thinking about in these situations is there an analogous case that does not involve AI, and what happens in those environments? And something that I'm not entirely clear on is, what would happen if a specialist were to provide guidance for a case and that specialist guidance ended up turning out incorrect, right? Would we be going after the specialist in the same way? Or is that something that's just kind of accepted as part of daily practice, that yes, we use these specialists, but ultimately it's the veterinarian who's overseeing the case who has the VCPR, so ultimately they are responsible irrespective of the specialist, right? So like, what would have happened if it came back the other way? So they sent off a mass through an FNA, sent it off to a lab. That lab comes back and they provide an incorrect diagnosis, which is even problematic, right? Because only the veterinarian with a VCBR can actually provide the diagnosis. But if they come back with an incorrect assessment of what's happening with that case and the AI was correct, then what happens at that moment? Like, what is the change there? And how do we think through that? So I don't really know what the legal precedent would be from that perspective, but I think it would be interesting to think about.
Yeah, I mean, I think that analogy to what is the non-AI version is interesting. I think people might argue it's not a direct apples to apples comparison, which I'm sure folks are beginning to make in this case. Robert, what was your take when you saw this news?
I wanted to first understand how the product was being positioned by Zoetis. Really, the only thing I found, and maybe I just didn't look in the right places, was some kind of vague sales language around it being a screening tool and it being, kind of hyped up. Did they publish data so that veterinary practitioners know kind of what the failure rate is, and basically, what it could be trusted to do, what it couldn't be trusted to do? Do we know?
I'm not entirely sure. We can definitely dig into this. It looks like there are some validation studies that we can kind of pull up and put in the show notes. I think this is one of the areas that when people look more broadly across a lot of the different applications out there, there's probably a perceived lack of transparency, but it does look in my quick scan that there is some rates that are published, but maybe it gets to like, is the positioning consistent with that? Are people aware of that? Does that make a difference? Is it changing their behavior? And what responsibilities then rest with the company versus the individual?
Yeah. Honestly, so my gut reaction to this is I think there's this phrase in finance, talking your book, right? I think we're gonna have a lot of people talking their book right now, which means you're just gonna use this to confirm your priors. I think there are some people in the industry who are all in on AI. This is, the second coming, the magic wands that you have in your hands. And there are others who are deeply, deeply skeptical about, its use, how appropriate it is, what it means, for civilization. And I think ultimately we're just going to see a hardening of those opinions. The nuance that I think this conversation really needs is I took a look at the, at least what was publicly available in the filing. And it's saying, like you said, fraud, misrepresenting, things like that. First, I don't think the conversation should be against an absolute of is the system perfect? Of course, it shouldn't be perfect. And I think there is a responsibility by the companies offering AI solutions to say where the edges are of this, where you can trust it, where you can't. That's critical. The industry deserves that. It needs that. But the second thing is, it really should be relative risk that we're judging this against, right? So not that, it's really sad, but this is healthcare and patients die in healthcare, and systems, mistakes are produced by systems that are human led all the time. And I think the logical way we have to look at this is, this kind of reminds me of self-driving cars, right? It's not, is a self-driving car perfect? It's, are you going to save more lives by using a self-driving car compared to not using one? And so my gut reaction to the lawsuit is I think, like Aaron said, it's a long time coming. There are, there's an interest, probably by a lot of amplifiers to this story that is more talking about how threatening and scary AI is. I'm not familiar with the technology that Zoetis uses, so I don't know if they got it over their skis as to what the system's set up to do and how it's positioned. But the lens that I would view any related technology through is the same one I would view any other technology through. It's relative risk and relative gains. Are we better off by using this technology in an appropriate way compared to not using it? And I find the lawsuit weird. First off, why is it coming from the practice and not the pet owner? And second off, it's hard for me to believe that, if Zoetis says this is a screening tool, why it just feels like there's kind of this weird diffusion of blame going on for a very, very sad situation that I suspect isn't wholly appropriate. Adam, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting. I think this particular case has a lot of human decisions that were made amongst a couple AI decisions. And I understand why the focus is on that particular part of where things broke down. But I think if I was to pick like a case that I think would really be held up as an example of the failures of AI, there's probably examples that where the results are a lot more direct and linear as opposed to in this one where there's multiple surgeries, there's complications, it's not like the black box says yes or no and the pet has a negative outcome. I don't think it's quite that simple. I think one of the things that people push back on against, and I tend to agree with your kind of relative risk framing, is that you can't have companies that are saying, or you can't have these technologies where look how amazing it is and how accurate, and these are all the shortcomings of veterinarians. But when it falls down or makes a mistake, we're kind of blameless. And the thing that's kind of interesting about the car example is you're seeing this a lot with like the future of car insurance, where I think these manufacturers are going to take on these responsibilities and the risk associated with that. And the bar is much, much higher than just a human driver, much, much higher. Otherwise, we probably already have autonomous cars, given the amount of people that get in accidents and pass away. So I think there's going to be a much higher bar for AI for a lot of these workflows than compared to like how humans make mistakes. I think one of the things that we're learning from this is that when you actually evaluate AI against humans, you're having to understand like how well the humans do in this thing today. And in some of those tasks, like not very good. So I think that's kind of interesting there. I think I'd maybe have a broader question of like, what does this indicate about where the profession is at in terms of their attitudes towards AI? Because I think that this will certainly have average practitioners be hesitant in some way, shape, or form, like the potential risk, the potential liability. There's a lot of examples where veterinarians choose a safer path or a more risk adverse path, or because they are concerned about the increase in liability or the increase in risk. And so do you guys think that this will change how veterinarians adopt these tools? Do you think there's veterinarians saying, hey, I was about to use this piece of equipment, or I was about to use AI more broadly for pathology, and now this is giving me concern? Like, how do you see this getting digested by your average practitioner?
I think it's really interesting to think about, like, yeah, and there's a ton of facts about the case that we don't know, right? And so we can only really talk about kind of a hypothetical situation that is framed by this particular case. And so we can imagine somebody who, and again, not saying that this is what happened, but we can imagine somebody abdicating responsibility to AI and just saying, okay, AI is saying this, and so therefore we should go ahead with that. But that has not been the guidance for many of the AI companies from the very beginning, right? This has always been an additional data point for somebody to consider when it comes to the case. The veterinarian is always going to have a greater sense of context as to what's happening with that case than what the AI is going to be able to give them. And I think for those people who are maybe more inclined to use the AI tools, this will confirm that they need to understand the tool within the context of the case and not take the tool on its own merit. And for some people, yeah, like it, you know, I think we're kind of hitting into that middle majority market when it comes to a lot of the AI tools. And for some people, this will be enough of a reason to say, I'm not really interested, right? But for those people who say this is a data point that perhaps will allow me to move more quickly, and can I make mistakes? Absolutely. So I have to maintain a certain level of diligence when I'm considering these things. You know, and that might be the overly optimistic perspective on it. And so that might not actually be what happens, but that's my hope, is that people would then just want to try to contextualize these a little bit more.
Maybe another example is kind of reading between the lines. Like, let's say the issue was your veterinary scribe recorded the wrong piece of patient information, and that made its way into the patient record. And maybe they're submitting an insurance claim, and that the presence of that phrase or that term or that condition, which is incorrect, ends up jeopardizing their policy and their coverage. You know, I think maybe in that case you can unwind some of that stuff, maybe that specific example. But at the end of the day, that medical record, it's not owned by the AI, it's owned by the veterinarian, and they're responsible for that. Like, I think these issues are likely to pop up a lot more as we just have more people using these tools. And so we're kind of getting to the point that you're having enough people's radiographs get interpreted and their slides get interpreted and their notes get interpreted. It just creates more surface area for those edge cases. And we're kind of, in some cases, becoming a little bit of a living lab for that, probably in part because we don't have the same oversight in veterinary medicine as human healthcare. I'm curious, are there examples, without necessarily getting yourself in trouble, but other kind of examples like that you're seeing, Aaron or Robert, where you're like, huh, like that's going to be an issue, or we're already seeing this edge case. And as a result, maybe this is how we're having to advise our customers, our partners, or the companies differently. Like, what would be the lesson coming out of this that we could take? Because this will not be the last example of this.
You know, what my mind goes to is, I mean, one, you're right. And what we're going to see is kind of this inexorable march of the frontier and these tools going mainstream, and they're going to be everywhere. And the reason they're going to be everywhere is because they unlock an absurd amount of value. And where I think the danger lies is when we have one, you know, like if companies are advertising just kind of the shock and awe, all the amazing things, you know, it's going to solve all your problems. Yeah, that's not appropriate. What we should be running on is just like a rigorous understanding of where the tools are at, what you can trust it for, what you can't trust it for, what you really need to be in the loop for. It's any other type of AI tool that, you know, what matters so much is that because we're heading into this world where these tools are going to be everywhere, there's just no way, one, for you not to use them and stay relevant in the profession, and two, for you to blind trust them and, you know, expect them to solve all your problems. You have to be super knowledgeable about what the tool is and how it's used. And so I think what's so important to me is that the profession really develops this type of literacy and fluency with what these tools are and how they work. And I hope that some of the work that we do, you know, with the show is helping people get there, because where we run into trouble isn't so much the using of tools, it's the not using them and not understanding them. And I don't know if that's what happened here, but I think if the profession gets blocked on the whole, one, it's because they were looking for an excuse to not trust AI, or two, it's because, you know, we have some sort of misalignment in what is being communicated about the tool and what is being understood about the tool and how it's being employed in practice. But Adam, you're the practicing DVM here. You're married to one. Like, I'd love to know how this would shape your perspective and how you're seeing this.
I mean, I think that workflow piece, and maybe this is a good segue to our next story, but like that workflow implementation, understanding AI in the context of the entire end-to-end experience, and this idea that your hands ironically are not off the wheel, right? You are very much in charge, and your job might look differently than it did before, because maybe you're not doing the interpretation directly, but you're synthesizing the information or integrating the systems or overseeing the AI. And this is probably a good segue to where this breaks down more from the client experience, because I think on one end of the spectrum, clearly AI failures that result in patient death are something that are going to be and should receive a lot of attention. But I think where you're likely to see as many or more issues are kind of like day-to-day kind of frictions or client experience issues, where like the AI just books the wrong appointment or takes too long or sends the wrong email or causes somebody to feel kind of put off from dealing with a client. And so kind of moving maybe to our next one, where we're kind of seeing now the rise of these AI receptionists. Andy Rourke, friend of the pod's friend of him. He came on last year to talk a little bit about some of what he was seeing. He wrote a blog post actually, or recorded a short video of a client, a friend of his, that actually had recently changed to his clinic. And when he asked her why this particular client booked with his practice, they said that they had spent 25 minutes trying to book an appointment for their pet for a Bordetella vaccine, and basically were like led in circles and it went nowhere. And so they had such a bad experience with that workflow and that clinic that they ended up changing clinics. And I think it's a really interesting example, because it really gets to what you're saying, Robert, which is like, hey, there's a failure in the in the AI at this point, but this broader workflow of how did we arrive at this standpoint? What were the decisions that were made? Why was the human like not elevated? What context does the practice have? How do you make sure this doesn't happen again? I feel like there's going to be a lot of these sorts of client issues as another area of the practice experience, client experience, in this case, reception, begins to incorporate these capabilities. So I'm curious what your take is on that one and how you kind of think about it relative to the risk associated with the case that we just spoke about.
I think like one, I'm really glad Andy flagged that this happened. I would see a very strong parallel with the first story, really, and I think 100%, there are going to be rough edges, even for the practices who like do all the right things, right? Like that's just what happens when you roll out a groundbreaking new technology. That happens. And two, it's about relative risk and benefit, right? Like how many poor experiences do pet owners have with human CSRs? Like this is not like, oh, does the AI do the job perfectly? It's like, what are the relative gains and opportunity costs from doing things in this new way? And then what's the way to optimize yourself to do it if there are gains to be had there? So I think to like talk about this story without the context of how the kind of overall rollout stacks up against the status quo, it is just not super helpful. Really, I think if we want to be sharp about this, we say, almost like if we could A/B test them and see what the pet owner experiences are compared to, like the normal status quo, and then I think there's actually some like data on this that's interesting that you stumped.
I have it right now.
Please, Adam, do it. Enlighten us. Yeah.
Well, I think so. There's a secret shopper sort of study done by Matt Saloy, and I think when he was at VMG or the VMA, but they called clinics, right? They called 5,000 attempts basically to understand that call friction. And what they found was that it was people who didn't book appointments. It wasn't because there wasn't capacity in the clinic, but there was about 20% of the cases where there was some sort of call friction, either like long hold times, like 8% of cases had 5 minutes or more, and 15% of folks were unable to speak with a staff member. And so what it gets to me is that we accept a certain level of friction or a baseline in terms of like just, let's say, human managed calls. But the reality is the result is the same. It's clients not being able to book in, patients not coming in, patients not being able to get the right care at the right time. And I think it is natural that we envision our best experience with a receptionist, or if I'm a receptionist, I'm thinking about like how well I handle this case. Look at all the personalized details that I have. I was able to talk a client through a really difficult scenario or plan a really complex procedure or euthanasia. But on the flip side, there's a lot of people that are calling for a very routine that isn't necessarily serviced. And so I think sometimes we like to inflate our worst AI experience and inflate our best experience with humans as a way to sort of justify why this is bad. And I think the other thing too is that, 3 or 4 years ago, even 2 years ago, the experience with AI calls sucked, right? Like it was the worst phone call. It sounded robotic. You had to repeat all this information. And for a lot of people, that's not just a couple of years ago. That might have been their last call with AI, right? And so they're envisioning, they're saying, wait a second, every business I call is going to look and sound like that. Like, sorry, like I'm out. and I think it's where we're getting, where things are evolving quite quickly. Another stat, Google has already placed 3 million AI phone calls that have led to updates to their business profiles that they have on Google Maps. Now with Android phones, you can actually have the AI call for you. And so the other side of this is veterinarians saying, well, I don't want to put an AI receptionist at my front desk because my clients are going to say this is a bad experience. It's the Bordetella example over again. I think they might look different if you flip it around here saying, do I want my human staff spending their time responding to transactional vaccine phone calls from a client's AI? So just a couple of data points and perspectives there, but you're bang on from my perspective, Robert, where I think it's not a one size fits all situation. Aaron, like obviously scribes are kind of getting into this space. What is the reception kind of jobs to be done look like? Are there lessons there? When you heard that Bordetella story, what did you think?
Yeah, it's interesting because there's, people like Bill Schroeder, who we haven't had on the pod, but is definitely somebody who understands a lot of what's happening with AI. And he definitely has examples of AI calling into clinics, asking for things like pricing and that sort of thing. And so we tend to think like, well, how are we as active agents with AI, and active agents just in the like general sense, not like AI agents, but how are we going to be leveraging AI? But the AI is already being used to those practices, not necessarily with those practices, right? So I think that's really interesting. It's also like I kept trying to figure out like what exactly is the terminology that we want to use in order to make sense of what's happening right now. And I found these quotes that I think are helpful. So demand is the hard part. Everything else is a solvable engineering problem, right? And so once the demand exists, then the engineering itself is less challenging than actually creating the demand. And it's pretty clear that there is a demand for particular types of cases. For example, being able to triage an after-hours case and just say, is this something that should wait till tomorrow, or is this something that needs to be seen right now? Being able to book an appointment. People want to be able to book appointments on their own time. And so there's use for it. Now, are people immediately going to be going to these like higher end, very complex cases, high touch relationships, that sort of thing? Like, I don't really see that happening, but I don't think that that's any different than like thinking that we're not going to have AI because we don't have AI surgeons, right? Like that just doesn't make any sense. And so if we like scale it back and say, what is the actual demand that exists and how is that going to be met by some of the AI tools that exist today? And to your point, like if you've tried to use some of these receptionists, they can be not such a great experience. Like I remember calling Domino's and saying like, I don't want pepperoni on my pizza. And Domino's was like, all right, pepperoni, double pepperoni on your pizza. And you're like, no, I don't, And so I like muddled through it, but those are terrible experiences for people. But those are relatively easy engineering problems compared to the demand, the creation of demand that we already know exists in the marketplace.
So maybe if you go ahead, Robert.
Yeah, just a slightly different, maybe complementary lens to Aaron. Our first episode ever of the show, we talked about this idea about how humans kind of are wired to see change linearly, and how we wanted to do this because it's a log curve, like it's an exponential that we're on here. And I think, like the way I understand this is I would bet within 3 months, a very specific AI is going to outperform 99% of CSRs out there across almost any situation. The reason I say that is because I think there is an engineering unlock that has recently happened specifically from OpenAI. So, it's a testament to how much the frontier has changed just in the last 2 months when the last time we recorded, right? So something called GPT Live came out. OpenAI figured out a very hard engineering problem. And before, like all these experiences, they were clunky. Like I wouldn't want to talk to an AI because there's this weird latency, right, in the conversation. It doesn't feel real. There's a kind of a neutering of the intelligence that you're dealing with. You don't trust that the other line is actually more competent than a human would be in that situation. But what OpenAI figured out is how to process information in the real time and route the heavier intelligence happening in the background so that you have almost these two processes happening concurrently, and you could have the real-time conversation along with the supercharged intelligence and access to like a huge amount of context in the background. And so, I don't know if you guys have used it, but it's live in the ChatGPT app right now. Like you can actually try out, it's still like early stages, but you can so clearly see what's coming. What's coming is, to me, the exciting advancements aren't just the raw increases in intelligence. It is the real-time communication with an AI where you're able to talk to it like a person, not just like type or dictate into this chat box and then wait a minute or two for a ChatGPT or Claude to get back to you. It's like real time, it's dynamic, it's in your ear, and you can have the the benefit of this super high bandwidth information channel going back and forth. And so what's happening is the frontier has moved in a way that makes the voice models so much more viable.
And if you're paying attention, you should be figuring this out now, because it's like we're almost there. We're almost at the point where, yeah, you should plug this in, and this should be how you're talking to your clients because of the engineering. That's just kind of how I'm seeing the frontier advances impacting what we're about to see play out across the industry.
Yeah, like it's a really good point that, two things can be true, right? Like 6 months ago, you could have had a really bad experience with AI, and also the place that we're going isn't going to be nothing like that. And I think for me, I think about like what makes a good phone call with any business, and there's really kind of three components. And one you touched on, Robert, a couple you touched about, like one is latency, right? It doesn't matter if it's a human or an AI. If it takes me forever to get a response, if it takes me ever to connect with somebody, if it takes forever for them to understand what I'm saying, I'm going to hang up. I think the bar is much higher for humans. People are willing to tolerate humans kind of figuring out with AI. If I was waiting on line for a minute and the AI wasn't responding, everyone's hanging up, right? So latency is a big one. The second is context, right? I don't want to have to repeat things. If I'm talking to a business that I know knows my pet, knows my address, knows my preferences, and I'm having to repeat that information, that's a bad experience. By the way, these aren't like AI specific things. This is what you train a great receptionist on, right? You don't ask them to, I'm going to confirm this information with you. I'm going to reiterate. I want to make sure this is up to date. Phrases that we train receptionists on, so that they're not just asking you answers to questions they should know. And then the third, ironically enough, is I think like agency, or the ability to like do the thing. If I'm speaking to somebody for half an hour and then by the end of it, they're like, oh, I can't actually do that, I need my supervisor, or I can't advise you on your pet, or I can't book that appointment. Not that you're useless to me, but you're kind of useless to me, right? Like I need the outcome of that call. And so I think when you put those things together, we've now reached a threshold where, to Robert's point, the latency and just the experience is much more pleasant, much more natural sounding, much more immediate. I can use context much more easily from your practice or from yourself. So in that case, it should have known that we can or can't book that Bordetella appointment. That's not necessarily the AI in a box's fault. It's the context that's being fed to it. And the third is it needs to be able to do the thing, right? It needs to be able to book that appointment. So when I look at the failure modes that manifested for Andy's example, it's, really, really terrible latency, took 25 minutes, no context, or at least very poor context, and couldn't book the appointment. And it turns out if that was a human or an AI, it's a bad experience anyway. And so I do think that we've reached a point where more people are going to be exposed to these next generation voice experiences. And it is such a departure from the ones of like the phone trees that it's not even like you're comparing AIs anymore, if that makes sense. Like it's a completely new thing. And I think, Robert, that's kind of what you're saying, where, hey, it's gone from maybe we'd use this occasionally to now almost a completely different league, if not a different sport than it was, I don't know, 180, 90 days ago.
I think that point in particular is really interesting. Like, so yes, the technology has advanced quite a bit, but the openness for integrations has also advanced quite a bit. And so one of those barriers that 365 days ago is just not nearly as prevalent today is the integration. The other thing, and this is more like, I don't know, we tend to focus a lot on what's happening at like a national or like North American perspective, but the number of AI companies that are doing this, these AI receptionists around the world, has been super interesting. And so it might be the case that the North American context is perhaps even a little bit behind what we're seeing on a global level, because I'm seeing more and more like Nordic countries are using these. Western European countries, Australia, New Zealand have these tools that are gaining quite a bit of traction. And it seems like they're facing fewer headwinds by practitioners in those contexts than we're seeing in North America. So it might actually be the case that North America is a little bit behind. And maybe there's good reason for that. Maybe because the integrations are a little bit easier in a global context. But all of those barriers that you just identified, Adam, like are all being reduced drastically, not just in North America, but on a global level as well.
You mentioned the integration, and that's probably a good jumping off point for our next story, which is this is something that there's a lot of news in the last couple of weeks. We saw a number of providers, including Covet, announce their two-way integration with EasyVet, one of the largest PIMS systems in the veterinary market. I think kind of a long time coming, where we started to see more direct integrations with these scribes. We also saw, Provet made a sort of a large announcement about their integration with ChatGPT and Claude into their MCP piece. So I think we're beginning to see what is marching towards a more integrated experience, or at least the announcements of it. Maybe help our audience understand, like, is this as big of a deal as you would hope? Is this like the end, the starting point? And I was looking at some comments online, and I think a lot of folks were kind of saying, well, the copying pasting was already like pretty quick, and I could do it in this way. Like, how different is it going to be? Like, maybe Aaron, walk us through, you were probably, for what you can share, why does integration matter? Does it matter that much? What other use cases does it unlock? And how does it move us towards accelerating maybe some of the larger, broader, transformative things that we're seeing in other industries? Or like Robert and we talk about, like on the pod, of like this incredible way to control my entire PC with my voice, but I'm still stuck in a broom closet for my PIMS experience. Like, Aaron, walk us through kind of what's gone into it and what we can expect.
There's definitely been a lot more opening up that's been happening in the marketplace, like just across the board with pretty much every software company. There are a few who are saying that they're not really interested in integrating with anyone else, and so they're definitely hitting pause on that. But for the most part, companies are becoming much more open, and it's interesting because people would say things like, yes, you might be able to provide me with a faster medical node than what I can type on my own, but the copy and paste is too much of a hassle, and so we're no longer interested in doing this, right? Now that point of friction is being removed, and so people are more inclined as we remove more and more of these barriers. And my hope is that we'll see more and more of a seamless experience kind of across the board, because when a corporation like IDEXX, who we have not had any problems working with IDEXX at all, they've been very clear and transparent from the very beginning about like how this relationship is going to work and what are the pieces that need to be put in place and all of that. When an organization, a very large organization like IDEXX, is taking the lead on some of these, like easing of the barriers to integration, like I think that says something for the entire industry. Now, it's not perfect, right? Because you still have to have the APIs in place in order to be able to have all of the functionality that people are looking for. And so it's definitely an iterative process that we're going through. But yeah, we're just seeing it more and more, and it's just making the lives of the veterinarians easier. And as this is starting to happen more and more, we find that people are kind of living inside the AI scribe space more and more, and they're not having to have 5 or 6 windows open up simultaneously, that they're doing all of their work in one space. And it just creates a greater clarity of thought for them as they're going through this, that it's just easier to focus on one thing rather than jumping from one program to the next all the time. And so I think that probably what we'll see as a result of this, although I don't imagine any papers or anything like that are going to be published on this, but I imagine that at some point we'll see that people are just experiencing a greater focus in their daily lives at work. But yeah, that's some of the stuff that we're seeing, and it's been wild and pretty awesome. And is it because of the pressure that's coming from a lot of different voices? I don't know. I think a lot of it is just people are wanting to provide the practitioners with the kind of tools that they need and to have them integrate in the way in which they need to. And the security questions, the concerns are being addressed. And so there are fewer and fewer barriers that are being put up around some of these integration opportunities.
Did you guys see Provet announced an MCP?
Yeah.
That's so. I mean, let's give a shout out to Provet for blazing the trail there. And an MCP, for the listeners who aren't aware, it's kind of like an API. It basically gives you a way to access database of a certain vendor. Yeah, I think like it's really cool to see that shift happening. It is, there are going to be market pressures that, necessitate that either way, just because the service, I mean, it's all about context now. It's all about how much context can you give a model. And the companies who don't make that easy are just going to go the way of the dinosaurs. The other thing I think we're seeing happen, Aaron, like you're talking about, is, and Adam, you've made this point before. It's like nobody wants to be hunched over on a computer, like typing. That's so dumb. What we want, that's just a relic of how we've done things in the past and how the technology evolves. What we want is to talk and, to listen and to be present with the people and the pets who are in front of us. And that's going to be the shape. It's all going to be just context being captured of, what you're saying. Adam, I liked your point about agency in the AI building world. That's called tool use, right? It's about having agents who can actually execute after you, imagine being able to not have to say something twice, but the agent is listening in the background. And it's kind of like, this is something I'm building for our organization. It's tracing the blast radius on a decision made. So who are all the consumers of this information that need to be informed of this thing happening? And how do I need to inform them? I think we're just going to see, like, over the next year or two, all these relics of the way we've, done before that oftentimes we've like clutched onto so tightly, they're just going to evaporate. And once you start just acting naturally in the real world and being able to trust that the agent isn't going to, do dumb things. I mean, it's going to be like, oh my God, of course I never want to go back to a desk where I'm hunched over and typing in things again. And so we're seeing, I think, the acceleration of that movement. And again, to me, I'm excited about the intelligence increases, but I'm probably more excited about the interaction improvements between humans and AIs, where, it's just so much more natural and the technology actually fades into the background and we're able to be more present with, who's in front of us instead of just constantly being beholden to these screens.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that I think we're in for a pretty significant paradigm shift. And I think this is probably, I use the phrase kind of modern day bloodletting, but I do think this future veterinarians will look at this last couple of decades, if not longer, when we had a bunch of people that loved animals, loved putting their hands on them, in some cases loved talking to people, and instead we shoved them in the back in a 14-inch screen for 3 out of the 8 hours of their day as just ludicrous. I think that it's becoming clear how broken, uncomfortable, and inhuman that entire way of working is, especially in a profession where I think even for people who are detractors maybe from technology, it's all about the human animal bond and putting your hands on animals. And ironically enough, we might come to a place there where both those needs and desires are being met. I do think maybe one thing to flag, and I think this will become a lot more interesting in future episodes as this evolves. I think one of the interesting things is that integration unlocks the ability for AI to start to handle a lot more of the work, as Aaron was saying. And with that comes new ways to think about governance, safety, monitoring, observations. You use the phrase blast radius, Robin. I really like it, where, when you're copying and pasting a scribe written note, you have a very clear human in the loop step from the person who knows what the outcome has to be and is responsible because of the alignment of incentives where, hey, the AI is doing this. It's helping me personally. It's my note. I need it to be accurate for my patients. And a lot of people view that as like a bug. And I actually think it was a feature of the first wave of this deployment because it forced a very well understood human in the loop step in a flow that was ultimately quite limited blast radius. It's one note for one person at a time for one patient. And now we are going to start to see billing. We're going to start to see medication reminders. We're going to start to see the receptionists. And with it is going to come this kind of team-wide approach to management. And so maybe I'm curious for you as we kind of end things with our listeners, what do you think is the next kind of wave of infrastructure that's needed as we start to use your own words, Aaron, like living in these individual scribes, but managing the entire practice, and what kind of maybe comes over from these historical systems to help coordinate that? Or what are new forms of, like, I don't know, multi-user, multi-species management that we need to consider?
I think that's one for Robert. Like, Robert, you're loving this stuff. So what are you seeing?
Oh my goodness.
How do you make sure as you plug them into your company, how do you make sure your agents to go off the rails, and what does it mean for practices as they do the same?
I think there are two things I'd love to talk about, and we're probably going to need to save, some for the next episode. Honestly, like the thing that is top of mind to me, one is like, validation, this idea of validation, right? What's changed so much in engineering over the last year is that with engineering, you kind of build the car, right? You're writing the lines of code that specify this, how the program behaves. With agentic engineering, which is very much a new skill, you're building the road. You're building the track for the car to safely go on, right? So that you have, and there are all these strategies that, the frontier has adopted and the AI native companies that have adopted, so that you don't get these weird like hallucination problems that you saw, a couple of years ago. Plenty you can do there. The thing that I'm so eager to talk about, you can't really talk about it all that much today, but is my honest answer to this, like what's the next wave of infrastructure? It's security. It is 100% security. As we're moving into this world where all these systems are going to be connected, there have been a really like deeply unsettling amount of hacks that have been in the news over the last few weeks of all the major model labs, Anthropic, OpenAI, what's the Kimi provided, Moonshot, which is the Chinese labs kind of, producing some impressive models now. The agents have been so capable at escaping their, what are called sandboxes, their like private environments that aren't connected to the internet, finding a way to do that and hacking another very secure company, because part of the test was doing this thing like with OpenAI. The test was like, score well on this benchmark. And the model said, okay, I think the best way to do this is to hack out of my environment, hack this company and change the benchmark instead of like, and so like, we're not set up for this right now. And what's happening is these Chinese labs are now producing impressive models that are going open source. Anybody could build on them, right? Anybody with like a decent amount of infrastructure in place. Russian hackers are having their collective wet dreams right now. I am really worried about security, especially as like we definitely should be taking steps to advance how all these systems are collected. But shit, I think the back half of this year, there are going to be a lot of really concerning security stories. Would love to dig into it more soon and don't mean to derail us, but that's my honest answer is like, I think security needs to be thought about now as we are creating these systems. What do you think, Adam and Aaron? Like, I want to know, do you see things differently? What would you build?
So I'll just add a little bit to the security thing. Like we're just seeing that people are starting to understand things like ISO 27001, SOC 2 Type 2 compliant. Like there's a bunch of things that are just starting to become part of the discourse that, to your point, like they probably should have been talked about a long time ago, right? Because there are these breaches that now exist as a result of people not necessarily having the language that's required in order to evaluate these products appropriately.
Yeah, I think this is where, a lot of the focus has been on the security and kind of safety in terms of like the hallucinations aspects and is it giving me the wrong information and I'm going to make a decision based on it. But when we talk about these agents kind of working autonomously and across ways, across tooling, across platforms that even they weren't either explicitly told to go to or weren't allowed to go to.
They set up message boards. They set up message boards and passed each other notes to escape. Yeah. Like, what the shit? That's
it sounds like kids in a detention. But I mean, I think that this is where some of those incidents we can unpack on kind of a future episode. But I would imagine there's going to be a lot more of them, and I think that it's going to help us harden those systems. So that as this gets deployed and rolled out at scale, more and more capable models come out, that we're at least looking and testing them in a way that maybe we weren't, 4 or 5 generations ago. The other thing I would say is that it really just reinforces that even if the progress was to stop right now, we just had these existing models for the next, 3 years, there's so much capability already out there that the implementation into your businesses and across your systems and with your team is actually like the biggest barrier. I kind of look at the way I work now, and even me, I'm like, I'm sure it will get much, much better in ways that I can't expect, but it's pretty darn good now. And I think if most people are kind of using these models to their full stability with the right context and tool use, the browser-based capabilities, the computer use capabilities have reached a point where they're already surpassing, what I can do personally. So it's kind of an interesting dynamic there.
I mean, Adam, if you compare the way you work now to maybe even just like a year ago, how many Adams do you think you could outperform? Like Adam of today versus Adam of, a year ago?
3 to 4. And then there's probably a lot of things that I would have had to hire people for. Like I had an agent that ran for 28 hours straight and probably did a project that I would have paid somebody 10 grand plus to do, for sure. Easy. So another practical example, and I'll have to go, is I recently got a new computer and I didn't have to install a single program. On my old computer, I got my AI to write, basically, this is how Adam uses this computer. These are the things you got to download. This is how I use it. And I booted up my new machine and I said, don't, grab my old machine's like copy of my files and things. Just read this note in terms of what programs you need to download and how I like to configure my working space. And it went and took me through a 6-hour kind of thing where it was doing it on its own, and Slack and Notion, all of them popped up on my computer without me ever having to go to that single website. So I've reached a point where I think last year I was citing other people's examples of like some of the crazy stuff that I was doing. And now like each week there's something that I can't believe how good it is. I haven't filled out a PDF form in a while because it can do it on its own and tap me on the shoulder when it needs something. I want to be thoughtful. Anything on this that we want to leave our audience with from this week? Any main takeaways before we wrap up?
To me, the thread is just the space that is opening between, continue to open between kind of keeping AI at an arm's length, both in terms of how you implement it and how you understand it, and those who really, see a responsibility to be deeply in the weeds about this stuff in implementation and following where the frontier is. Because if you see how these tools can work now and you see where the frontier is going, you're going to be a lot more serious about security. I really hope these PIMS companies are. It's finding 0-day exploits against Apple. So, you really have to lock down your shit. I think WordPress is fucked. And I think you also are starting to see the magic that Adam's talking about, where, man, if you really get how to use these tools, you can produce in a way that it's just like, once you see that, it totally changes your calculus as to how much value you should bring in a single hour. Aaron, what do you think?
I think it's just really interesting. Like, we talk about AI as this really broad category, but then we see these like individual movements within AI, and these seem to like keep repeating the same process, right? Like, we kind of overhype it at the beginning, and then there's some pushback because some incident happened, and maybe that's like latency of phone calls, or maybe that's a lawsuit or something like that. And these are serious issues for sure. But the general trend is towards adoption of these within the practices. And so watching this kind of stuff happen again and again and again is really interesting. And I do feel like it's getting faster. And so the speed with which we get over the hurdles and the barriers that have been put in place, I think, is getting faster. And so we're just adopting more and more of these tools more quickly. And it's so interesting to watch it happen in all of these different areas within AI, all following the same model again and again.
Well said. Thanks for tuning in this week. Look forward to catching folks next week, and I'm sure we'll have the latest and greatest AI news for our audience. Take care, everybody. Have your pets spayed or neutered.